See everybody. Was it afternoon? It's still morning. Good morning. Good morning. I want to welcome you to the last of our season for the Mind, Body, Spirit series. And I want to just make a special recognition, and I think they're both out of the room, but Lisa Namazi and Susan Lucan have done so much to help for all of these throughout the 18-19 calendar year. They have shown up early. They set the food out. They make sure everything is set up the right way. They order the food. They help take it down. And I just wanted to recognize them. Is Lisa, is Susan back there? Yes. Well, bring them both out. She's leaving. We'll recognize them when they come back in. So. In any case, what I'd like to do now is I want to introduce the speaker, but just beforehand, I'm just kind of share an account. Now we can do this. So Lisa and Susan, let's thank them for their hard work. Yeah. So, before I introduce Felix, I just wanted to say that the idea of the opioid crisis is something I followed with a lot of professional curiosity, but it sort of dawned on me, and sometimes you have these strange realizations of like how or why things could become a problem. And so a few years ago, my sister had torn her rotator cuff and had the rotator cuff repair and surgery. And so she was given some narcotic pain medication to help. And she came home with this giant bottle of pills, and she thought, oh my gosh, is this, she was worried, am I going to need this much painkiller? And my brother-in-law, who happens to be a family practice physician, was a bit shocked in how much painkiller came home with her. And she ended up only using a few of them, and then I think they discarded it. But in discussions with my brother-in-law, and then hearing a little bit more, it's like this is the sort of thing that just one of the many ways in which these problems can perpetuate themselves was this, that if you have more than you need and you're using it, or worse, more of a worst case is people go and sell it to make some money. So So it was interesting, and just one of those small things that sort of dawned on me, like, wow, I really can see how this has become a problem. So I'm really happy to introduce our speaker, Dr. Felix Rogers, who has been a member here for 45 years. And I asked him about what he's done here, and he said, well, I've been about on every committee in the church. And I thought that was really interesting. But I've sure enjoyed getting to know Felix in the time I've been here, and appreciated his friendliness and kindness to me and my family. He is graduate from the Kirksville College of Osteopathic Medicine, did his internship and residency in the Detroit area, and then went to Emory University for fellowship in cardiology, and he's been practicing for some time here in cardiology. About 80% of his time is join me in welcoming him today. Thanks.
Thank you. Now, is this right with the mic? You keep that one, and I can. Oh, let's see. Yeah, I am. At least it says it's working. Can you hear me? Okay. All right. So, thank you, Steve. That's very nice, and I appreciate your personal comments about what happened in your family. And I think this is one of those topics that probably everybody at some point in time has had a friend or a family member who's dealt with opioids and has had an experience with it. And I want to, let me just see if I can get this right here. I really want to acknowledge you and your committee, though, for this program you've put together. I don't think I've ever been involved in a project where somebody invites me in August to give a presentation at a church in April. So that's remarkable that you're so well organized. Now, let me see. This is not right. Let's try this. Yep. Okay.
see if, you know.
Is this a portable?
Yeah.
Oh, I
it's
can just
portable.
move this over.
Yeah.
All right. Yeah, okay. All right, thank you. This is good. Now, one of the things that have led to this being an opioid crisis is that it turns out many of the policies and many of the practices have been defined by people or entities that have clear-cut conflict of interest. So let me make clear about my conflict of interest here. I have none. I have no financial disclosures or nothing, no affiliations with any organizations. Not only that, I'm not even an expert on addiction medicine. I'm a cardiologist. But in the field of medicine, periodically we have situations that arise in which a problem becomes so important it takes on public health consequences. And at that point in time, every physician is expected to be involved. This happened in the early 1980s. Upstairs, I remember standing right by the outside the library there, and somebody came up to me and said, the presiding bishop is holding a meeting about the AIDS crisis. What do you think? Here, mild-mannered cardiologist. But that's when the AIDS crisis hit, and we've had similar things happen over the years, and every doctor needs to be a cancer specialist, a diabetes specialist, a hypertension specialist, and every one of us needs a working knowledge of addiction medicine. So that's how I justify my presentation to you today. Now, as a proud granddad, though, let's start with this picture. Can you see this? This is, it's entitled Artwork by Jack. This is my grandson, Jack. And Jack was just barely 5 years old when he did this. Now, I know that Father Bill could spin a 30-minute sermon on this artwork because it has multiple layers of complexity, including what looks like a Donald Trump haircut. Now, I don't know what a 5-year-old is doing in that regard, but here's my concern. Look at his signature. Can you see his signature here? It's what?
J's backward and the C's backward.
Yeah. Now, is that a cause for alarm?
Not when you're 5.
Not when you're 5. Well, why not? I mean, isn't this like early autism or dyslexia or something like that?
Not necessarily.
Not necessarily. That's reassuring for you to say that to me, but that's exactly the point that I want to start with today, and that is what we're going to talk about, and the basis for our beginning discussion and our beginning understanding of opioids is that this involves neural circuits. This involves brain circuits. And the starting point for that is neuroplasticity. Neuroplasticity is this concept that as nerves develop, there's learning that takes place. And some of this is learning that's taught, and some of it's learning that happens as a result of how we do things. My grandson is learning how to sign his name, and he doesn't see it. He doesn't see that his J's go in the wrong direction and the C's go in the wrong direction. But all of us have confidence that as he grows and matures, these things will straighten themselves out. And to me, anyway, everything I see in the world, I filter through the world of meditation because that's the guiding influence in my daily activities. And that's our starting point there as well, that if we can keep these distracting things, these negative influences from racing through our neural circuitry, the way we're put together is we are bound to have normal function, and that our neural circuits will optimize themselves and promote health. What we're going to talk about today, though, is an insidious chemical response that is not at all normal and not at all natural, and it can create permanent problems with neural circuitry because of how these chemicals influence neuroplasticity. It's been around a while. This is an interesting set of photographs from Science magazine. We know that alcohol was used in the Fertile Crescent 10,000 years ago, and there's probably good evidence that opium was used for at least 3,000 years. And in part of the support for that are these urns that are 3,000 years old from Cyprus. And notice how they look just like these poppy seeds. So there's no coincidence. I think you would be naive to say that that was not a container designed to hold opium that would be used as either part of a religious or a medicinal ceremony. It's possible, though, and the author of Science Magazine asked, were the ancient Mesopotamians using this to get high? So those are the three options: ritual, medicine, or just plain have fun and get high. So here are the things we're going to talk about today. We're going to start with the science of addiction, what goes on with the neurophysiology, what are these nerve circuits that we're talking about, and then take a look at where we stand now with opioid use itself as a public health problem, and then its links to overdose and suicide. And then spend a little bit of time talking about what the implications of this are for medical policy and for social policy, because they're really two separate issues here. So let's start with an overview of the problem. And this is pretty sobering, that 8 to 10% of people over age 12 in America have some sort of a substance use problem, whether that's opioids or alcohol. But 8 or 10% of the population, 20 to 22 million people have this problem. And when we count in tobacco as a substance abuse problem, the cost to our society is $700 billion a year. And you remember Eric Dirksen, who said a billion here, a billion there. After a while, it starts to add up. Well, this is added up to $700 billion per year, the cost in lost wages, and in some cases, the cost of incarceration and health care related to these addictive behaviors. Now, for centuries, we've treated this as a criminal problem, and that doesn't work. So in terms of spoiler alert, I heard Father Bill say this at one time, just to let you know what my message is today, this is a sad story with an unhappy ending. Because America incarcerates a higher percentage of its population than any other country in the world. So just to get started on this topic, the whole idea of a punitive society whose first reaction to solving a problem is lock her up, that's not going to be a good starting point for something as complex as addiction. So this, I'm just warning you now, this is a sad story with an unhappy ending. So the neurobiology model, or the brain disease model of addiction, says that if we understand the pathophysiology, if we understand the healthcare aspects of what's going on with addiction, we can use that to guide policy development, and we can use that to guide medical treatment. Let's just take a few minutes to talk about these aspects of addiction. So there are three basic phases of the addiction process, and I'm going to show you a diagram of the brain in just a minute here. But these three phases are binge and intoxication, withdrawal and negative effect, and then preoccupation, that is, persistent seeking of drug and anticipation of reward. So the first step here, binge and intoxication. So these drugs work by having a powerful influence on reward centers in the brain. And any of us could take one of these compounds, one of these addictive medicines, and feel that immediate pleasurable response. Fortunately, only 10% of the people who use these substances will become addicted. Yes?
Are the pleasure centers in the brain and the pain centers in the brain the same place?
No, they're not, and that's why it's interesting. And, you know, I think the reason I was asked to speak on this was because a couple of years ago when Bill Danaher and I did a program on a book by Henry and Nouwen about pain and suffering. The issue is that we tend to get those two things put together, and they're not necessarily the same. The centers for pain are nociceptive centers. That's the medical word for pain. And then the affective, the emotional centers are different. Now, sometimes they overlap. and so that a pain relieving center is also attached to the reward center for getting high. But for example, an anesthesiologist could give a medicine to relieve pain like a spinal block, an epidural block, no high involved at all, so that they can be separate. But what we're talking about here are opioids, addictive substances that do reach that emotional center along with the pain relief. But they don't have to be linked together. Yes?
When you talk about addiction,
Yes.
would you put kleptomania and just overeating in that same class, only milder?
Yeah, so there are lots of addictions, and binge eating is one. And people can become, an addiction is a behavior pattern that is undertaken initially because of a reward, and then becomes out of control because of these neural circuits that become entrained, and through neuroplasticity lead to these, they're called neuroadaptive changes that cause persistence of that behavior, which then may be very counterproductive. And binge eating is one of them. Nicotine use is another. Alcohol can be another.
Yeah, when I got shingles, and the day
Yep.
before it broke,
Uh-huh.
I was in incredible nerve pain.
Yes.
So I went to the emergency room, they couldn't figure it out, but they gave me a drip of Oxycontin-ish something.
Yeah.
It was fabulous.
Oh, yeah.
So the thing is, if I had no responsibilities, I could hang out like that for a long time. It was just, but you can't do it. You can't live life like that, but, which is part of the issue, but I just gotta say, it feels wonderful.
Yes, right. And so, you could be in sales, couldn't you? I mean, you're...
I'm an advertiser.
Yeah, well, close. All right, so the thing about this binge and intoxication, though, is when the person first takes this compound and then they get that, it's activated these pleasure centers that releases neurochemical compounds, especially dopamine, that create that feeling of euphoria and intense pleasure. And of course, it was Larry, I think, who told me just a minute ago, it's that first experience that's the best. It's like that first sip of champagne, that first glass. Yeah. And then, though, what happens is that as these patterns persist, after a while, your brain stops reacting to the presence of this addictive, let's call it morphine, this addictive substance, and instead it starts reacting to the anticipation of that substance, like Pavlov's dog. They would ring the bell, the dog would get food, and after a while they could ring the bell and not have food there, and the dog still salivated as if the dog was going to get the reward of the food. And as this occurs, the release of dopamine is sort of diminished, and other compounds are released, which actually cause very unpleasant feelings. And these unpleasant feelings lead to dysphoria, the opposite of euphoria. And this dysphoria means the person is now feeling terrible. So the typical addict starts off getting that high, pure pleasure, feels great, I love this, I could do this forever. And then after a while, though, the way the neuroadaptive changes proceed, they stop using the drug to feel high. They're using the drug now to avoid pain and the misery that they have when they're going without the drug. So it's not the first day they take it, they were feeling fine before they took the drug. Now they're taking the drug because they feel miserable. So dysphoria becomes the predominant motive for continued drug use. They're escaping this dysphoria. So it starts with a high, and then as the neuroadaptive changes occur, they're escaping dysphoria. The second part of this story here is then the withdrawal and the negative affect, because as we all know, life is a package deal. When we look at the circumstances of our day, it's not just feeling pleasure that's part of our day. but it's what we do. I mean, it's our job, it's our ability to make solid judgment, it's our ability to enjoy the company of our friends and our children, and to step out on a day in Michigan in which the sun is shining and say, wow, this is overdue. You know, these are all parts of what's going on in our daily lives, but for the drug addict, they start to withdraw from participation in these things. They lose pleasure in ordinary events, ordinary activities. They lose a sense of meaning of what's going on in their life. And as a result, they are starting on a pathway toward depression. And they may feel withdrawn, they may feel anxious, they can have many negative emotions that develop and become overwhelming for them. But at the same time, they've got these neural circuits that are now trained toward this idea of this reward that they experienced. They felt it. It was great when they felt it that first time. And then they begin seeking this behavior. And pretty soon, every waking moment is spent thinking, how do I get that substance again? How do I get high again? How can I do this? And what happens at this point in time is that they overpower the prefrontal cortex and the judgment centers of the brain, and they lose solid reasoning. So they can say, yep, I'm in therapy, I'm seeing a counselor once a week, I want to quit. I've made a decision to quit. Then on their way home, they buy some dope and do it all over again. Because even though they can say on one level, I've made this decision, the fact is, these substances erode executive function to the point that people can't make good decisions anymore. So when we look at this situation, we find then that this is that St. Paul who said, you know, I do what I don't want to do, and I don't do what I do want to do. You know, I mean, he's like a counselor. And, you know, anyway, so pretty obvious situation. We've all experienced that on St. Paul's level. But here we are, the drug addict is taking the drug when they really don't want to. They've said they're not going to, and they may take more than they want to, and they may just be completely out of control and can't stop it all. These are all biologic phenomena. This is not criminal behavior. This is something that happens to people who do these drugs. It happens to about 10% of people who are exposed to these addictive compounds. It doesn't have anything to do with serving time in prison or any of these other things. This is a medical problem. Now, I keep thinking I'm going to see this diagram, so let me just go right ahead to this diagram that's too small for you to see. But the point is that these are areas of the brain that are all tied together, so that the initial reward sections of the brain then tie into the parts of the brain that are involved in drug-seeking behavior. They tie into the parts of the brain that are involved in executive function and judgment and decision-making. They tie into the parts of the brain that allow us to enjoy a beautiful sunshine day. All of these things, it's all tied together. These are all parts of neural circuitry. And these neural circuits begin developing when we're young, and as we get older, just biologically, this is just in the normal natural state, these circuits don't mature until about age 21 to 25. The younger the person is when they're exposed to addictive substances, the more likely these changes are to be permanent. The more likely they are to be addicted. So that if the general population has about a 10% likelihood of becoming addicted to these substances, it's far higher for younger people. Well, I was talking with Shirley Green just before the meeting today, telling her about patients that I would see who started smoking cigarettes at age 10. And now I still see people who started smoking cigarettes at age 15 or 16. For those people, it's almost impossible for them to quit. Nicotine is a very serious addictive substance, and the younger the person is at the time they begin the more difficult it is for them to quit. And that's because of these components of neuroplasticity. And when we have an immature brain in the setting of addictive medicines, that's a serious bad combination. I forgot the most reassuring thing any speaker can do is put their watch right in front of them. Okay, so yeah, no, you need to have confidence that I will look at it.
On the radio, you always hear, and even on TV, the Juul.
Yes.
Where it's, okay, it's no longer cigarettes, but it's all nicotine.
Right.
What is this supposed to try to do?
Yeah, so that's a hot button topic right now. And so these ideas of vaping. So they say it's not smoking, it's vaping. And they say it's very effective in helping people quit smoking cigarettes. Turns out there's no research evidence at all that's of any benefit. And unfortunately, these compounds have been around for such a short period of time, we don't have any research evidence showing the harm that they might create. It's just logical that they're bad. So we've got a new law that's pending nationwide about access to tobacco products. Somehow, these vaping companies have enough political clout, they were able to get an exemption from that law. Well, it hit the American Heart Association and it hit their email blast to people like me, and so I'm firing off emails to Gretchen Whitmer and my Congress people and everybody I can think of, because we're all trying to get back about this. It's one of those situations we sense we've got a very serious problem on our hands. It's completely unregulated, and there's no strong evidence either way to address this. But we just know that nicotine is nicotine. Mm-hmm. So, I'm sorry, yes, Sandra.
How about marijuana? Does it also affect the pleasure?
Marijuana does affect those things, and you know, there are people now who are using marijuana and then this derivative CBD oil and things like that for pain control. But I don't think there's a level of worry about it in terms of being an addictive substance, the way opioids are.
The marijuana or the oil?
I don't know anything about the oil. It's supposed to be completely non-addictive and not even have the pleasurable high, you know. Yes, Steve?
I was just going to ask you, did you want questions in the middle
Oh,
of the presentation, or do you-
they're coming, so I'll take them. I'll do anything, all right? Okay. Oh, I see, okay. So where do we stand at the moment? I told you I had a sad story with an unhappy ending. The United States represents 5%, and we consume 80% of the world's opioids. What's wrong with this picture? Isn't that a sobering statistic there? 5% of the population using 80% of the world's opioids. And they're the leading cause of death now for all Americans under age 55. More people die from opioid poisoning than die from diabetes and that die from HIV/AIDS. This is why I've had to learn something about this. This is a public health emergency.
5%, 80%. Pharmaceutical companies?
You were going to get to that, but you're exactly right. That's a major part of this. And just to know where we stand in Michigan, we're 10th highest in the country in terms of the percentage of our population in the state who die from opioid overdose. And in terms of our ability to treat, we're 6th from the bottom. 44 states ahead of us doing a better job of having physicians capable to treat long-term opioid use with medicines that are like methadone, things that are protective.
Those numbers include fentanyl,
Yes,
heroin.
yes, right. So they're not only the prescription opioids like OxyContin, but then fentanyl, and then it's synthetic, you know, what do you want to say, black market versions as well. Yeah.
Well, I've heard that probably the drugs that are on the market, say on the street somewhere, 80% of them are prescription drugs.
Well, it's a high percentage of them. And as we'll see later when we try to pinpoint why this crisis is so far out of control, the supply side theory supports the fact that it may be related to physician prescription of these things. Here's an interesting slide though, Larry, just to follow up on that. This is overall opioid deaths since 1980 up until 2016. And notice this is a hyperbolic curve, isn't it? This is a logarithmic increase in death. Yes, and what's even more sobering about this, though, is since 2009, prescriptions for opioids have decreased. So the mortality is continuing to rise at an exponential level, even though fewer prescriptions are being written. Right, I don't have numbers for those countries. So here we are, we've got this epidemic with this peculiar characteristic. If we try to pinpoint it on doctors writing too many prescriptions, that's not the answer. And what is probably happening with these people is that they got addicted. Our policies in terms of treating addiction are sufficiently dysfunctional that they're going out on the street and they're buying drugs that are less expensive, like heroin, and buying drugs that are more powerful, like fentanyl, and they're overdosing on them.
No, it's coming in illegally. It's coming in.
No, I think the key word here was supposedly. Yeah, and so part of the problem is that there are lots of people with advanced degrees in organic chemistry who found a nice moonlighting job. Yeah, and they're producing, garage fentanyl. Same here. When I do procedures in the hospital, we always start with fentanyl. So the chief wellness officer at an organization called the Wellbeing Trust said that there are really two parts to this, though. One is a healthcare issue, and the second is a problem in society itself. And that's the one I'd like to make sure we include as we go through this just a little bit more. So just a few little more things about numbers here. And when we look at suicide, overdose and suicide are. When we look at the total number of people who die from combined suicide and unintentional overdose, in the last 17 years, it's gone from 4,000, what's that, a 2.5-fold increase in mortality in just 17 years. So the reason these are linked together is that if someone has a lot of pain, they're more prone to have depression. If they're depressed, they're more prone to have suicide. If they've got a lot of pain and they really need their opioids, they're more likely to develop this craving for opioids, and they're more likely to make risky decisions about drug taking. So they're tied together that way. Yes?
When they move on to heroin or control the urge,
Yeah.
high,
They're-
it's gotta control the.
It's trying to get rid of that dysphoria. They're so addicted at this point in time, they'll do anything, including drive from a nice posh suburb like this into the city to try to get these drugs. Yeah. All right. So these these problems with suicide, though, are particularly difficult because if somebody's found dead and their blood levels show they died of opioid overdose, was that an intentional overdose or was it an unintentional overdose? Only 1/3 of suicide victims leave a note. And even if a person happens to survive an overdose of opioids, you may not be able to count on what their recollection of the circumstances are. And we also know that there's medical examiner bias, that if an African American person is found dead of an overdose, it's more likely to be listed as a drug overdose, and a white person is more likely to be written off as suicide. For reasons of, this is the way we look at it. You know how all those people use drugs downtown, Highland Park. They use a lot of drugs down there, and they die because of that. So we have these things that are all tied together, and we've got medical drivers and we've got social drivers. So the issues, I think I covered these things here. Let's just go to the increased demand for opioids and the increased supply of opioids. Now, the typical risk profile of a person who's going to die of opioid overdose is a middle-aged white male. Now, where have we heard that before? Who's the most likely person to be involved in going into high schools and shooting everybody up? And who's the most likely person to be involved in a white nationalist movement, but white middle-aged males? And one theory about that is that it's happening because there's this widespread income inequality and sense of despair, particularly in the uneducated white population. And so they've got this feeling of hopelessness, and in one segment they wish to regain a magical past with white supremacy that was probably never really there, and it predisposes them to sympathy toward white nationalist movements. And on the other hand, there's that sense of despair, and things aren't what they want them to be, and that despair leads to a demand for opioids. But the highest risk population for suicide is the white middle-aged male. And males are twice as likely as females to commit suicide. So we've got these drivers of the situation that are probably tied in not only with intrinsic male-female differences, but also by these social factors here. And when people start getting into opioid use, because of this disconnect with executive function and reasonable decision making, it leads to social isolation, to depression, to bad decisions, to unemployment, to financial difficulties. It's a spiral of events that can lead to this despair that might be part of the overdose and suicide. The other thing is that we get these periodic, they call them epidemics, and that is that everybody's going along and life is good and somebody introduces crack cocaine. Well, all of a sudden that's the hot ticket. That's the cool thing. It's inexpensive, it's brand new, a whole new set of dealers show up with this thing, and people start using crack cocaine. And nowadays it's fentanyl. Fentanyl is the new thing that we're dealing with here. And years ago it was heroin. So we've got this basic demand for these drugs, and then periodically we go through these fads of things that are further available to us. Now, the flip side of this is the supply side of the issue of opioids. And Steve, you were mentioning how this family member had a great big bottle of opioids. And we've learned that if physicians do in fact prescribe a large bottle of opioids, something's going to happen to that. It's going to get used. And now we have more and more changes that are related to trying to restrict opioid prescriptions by, first of all, limiting the number of prescriptions that can be written, but then also the duration of time for which they can be written. Yes,
I
Kate?
just recently left the hospital. Opioids now only give you 7 days now.
Yeah.
That's it, 7 days, 1 week.
And Kate, you told me before we started, tell me what your experience was taking opioids and what happened when you quit. Oh, I'm sorry, can we hand you the microphone?
Well, 6 weeks ago, I stupidly fell off a step stool in my kitchen and broke my back. So I had fentanyl in the ambulance. I had morphine, which I hated. That IV just makes your body incredibly hot. And then I was on hydrocodone for 3 weeks. And I was wondering about the relationship from being on pain, because my daughter was in a car accident 15 years ago and she almost died, and her doctor told her she wouldn't become addicted to it as long as she was in pain, taking it for pain. Is that right?
No.
No. Okay. Okay, so
That's part of the...
that was 15 years ago.
Conversation over.
No.
No.
Okay, so that's not possible. So I was on hydrocodone for, we tried to do other things. You know, we've experimented, and it was the only thing that would get to the pain of because my back, I found out I just found out Friday it compressed more after the accident. So it was in a pain process. So I was on opioids for 3 weeks. The pain stopped very suddenly, though. I mean, I went from 6 a day to 2 a day in 1 week, you know. And then I was telling them, they never tell you what the side effects of coming off of it are. I had some bad stomach upset for 5 days, chills, and I was blaming my wonderful rehab center, and my doctor said, no, that was coming off the painkiller, and she read off all the things that I could have had, and I took the ones I had, and I said, great, I'll take those side effects as opposed to what I could have had.
So your short period of time on these drugs was long enough that you developed the aversive feelings. So it wasn't that you were trying to get more of this medicine because you liked that high. You were feeling bad. You already had the dysphoria. And so you were feeling rotten, and you didn't formulate this, but this is how an addict potentially could react by saying, man, I feel horrible when I'm not taking this medicine. If I take it again, maybe that feeling will go away. So you're not taking it to get high. You're taking it to get rid of your misery.
Oh, and I would say, too, I went off of it. I went down to 2, and I said, I'm not having breakthrough pain. You know, I'm not having pain at 8 and 9, and I'm going to go off of it. For 3 days, I could not think. I mean, I was talking to Larry. It stays in your body 2 to 4 days when you quit.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so you're fighting a lot of stuff.
Yeah. All right.
Stays in your hair for 90 days. So my daughter said, don't have a ticket.
Yeah. All right. So let me just move on here to another topic here. So we've had a couple of people sort of wondering, you know, who are some of the players in this crisis, and how did this emerge here? Well, patients, physicians, rogue pharmacists, distributors, and manufacturers. That's the roster of the guilty parties here. And part of it involves this thing that I discussed a couple, 3 years ago with Bill on our book by Henry Nouwen about pain and suffering. And I quoted Rachel Naomi Riemann, who was talking to this mother, and she said, no, you just went and kissed that baby's, the toddler just skinned his knee and you kissed it. And how's that going to help the pain? And she said, it's not going to help the pain. It's going to help the suffering. And, you know, we tend to forget this component of things here. And so many pain clinics set themselves up to treat pain, and they rely on opioids, and they don't address the suffering because that's much more complicated and more difficult to do. So the contributors to this problem include well-meaning physicians like me. 20 years ago, I was told that unless I attended an all-day seminar in pain relief, I would not have my state license renewed. And I was told that by a series of people who sponsored this conference. And in retrospect now, 20 years later, I wonder if that included Purdue Pharmaceuticals and some of these other major players that we know are just now out-and-out criminals. And there was no conflict of interest declaration or anything like that. I had to attend this, and the key take-home point was patients deserve to be relieved from their pain, and these medicines really are not addictive.
And that started long before 20 years ago.
Well,
When
okay.
I first went into practice as a surgeon in Virginia in 1974, it was all over, not just medical press, but
Yeah.
the lay press. There were front page articles in the Washington Post and everywhere about how doctors were not properly treating the pain of their patients.
Sure. And like,
And when I came out of residency, we were trained to give very little in the way of pain medication post-operatively once a patient left the hospital. In the hospital, you know, okay, we were pretty liberal with it. By the time we went home, be careful about what you wrote, but everybody was just jumping on the bandwagon. Nobody should ever feel a twinge of pain ever. Mm-hmm. And that's part of what fed into all this. And we started seeing where I was practicing, these people going up and down the I-81 corridor and just randomly hitting doctors' offices and going in and complaining of back pain.
yeah.
Well, how do you decide whether the back pain is real or not? There's no real test for it. So they were getting prescriptions.
Right, and so well-meaning physicians
Yeah.
wrote prescriptions and contributed to this problem. But we also have greedy physicians. And one of my friends who's an internist, her husband is a prosecuting attorney for the city of Detroit, federal prosecuting attorney. And he's got a video clip of this man walking in, and he takes off his winter coat. He sits down, puts on a white coat, his doctor's white coat, and for the next hour and a half wrote prescriptions for opioid pain medicines. Got up, took off his white coat, put on his work coat, his winter coat, so he could go back outside again. So this was how he allowed his brain to cope with the fact that he was writing murderous, quantities of opioids, and this thick stack of prescriptions then works its way into the population. So these greedy pill mills are part of the process as well. So there are two types of physicians who contribute to this problem. In terms of prescription drugs, OxyContin is one of the worst offenders, and that's a drug that's produced by Purdue Pharma. And as I mentioned here just a minute ago, even though the number of prescriptions is falling, the opioid deaths continue to rise. Another component to this insidious problem are the drug distributors, the official drug distributors. And these are some of the major players in the American economy. Cardinal Health, McKesson, AmerisourceBergen, Henry Ford Health System probably gets 90% of their stuff from these guys. But they also distribute these drugs. They distribute these drugs in a completely unprofessional, unethical way. 3/4 of prescriptions, this is from a New York Times article a couple of days ago, 3/4 of prescriptions at a Queens pharmacy that were supplied by Amerisource were written by doctors who were later indicted or arrested. McKesson kept shipping drugs, these like OxyContin, to pharmacies for 6 years, even though they received repeated warnings that these are drugs that are being given to people who get their prescription from one of these pill mills where the doctor is just writing these prescriptions. And McKesson didn't stop until the doctors were indicted. It's not as if they said, oh yeah, we understand this is a public health problem. People are dying of opioid overdose. No, they saw dollar signs and said, we're going to keep shipping product as long as we can until somebody gets arrested. We're going to keep shipping product. Yes, Kate?
Is OxyContin and oxycodone the same?
No, they're similar though.
Oh, they're similar.
Yeah.
Well, they all the drugs have similar molecules.
Yeah.
Because they all attack the same receptor sites.
Yeah. So here we've got this problem on our hands that it seems like every component of society is involved. So I raised the question, any chance we could have seen this coming? Well, if we're going to ask that question, we have to say, well, who were the prophets of our time? Wouldn't that be the person who would give us a clarion warning some 10 or 20 years before the rest of us would catch on? And after Martin Luther King gave his speech about I Have a Dream, for the next 3 years, he devoted all his energy to helping us as a society confront what he saw were the 3 most important pressing issues of our society: racism, materialism, and militarism. And that was so uncomfortable to hear that most people sanitize Martin Luther King, and all we do is talk about I Have a Dream, right? We got rainbows out there and the little kids, and they're all taking flowers and putting them in buckets and stuff like that. And nobody's addressing the seriousness of racism, militarism, and materialism. Those are the key features that Martin Luther King saw. Now, I commented a little bit about the opioid overdose being a white, and especially fatal overdose, being a white man's disease. But as it turns out, the African American population is disproportionately affected by this because of our tendency to incarcerate the black population at levels much higher than the rest of the population. And militarism, militarism is not being opposed to having a strong military. Militarism means taking a military approach to a problem where it's not indicated. It's like our war on drugs, right? This is a biological medical problem. It's extremely complicated. It requires nuanced policy developments. It's not lock 'em up. It's not a war on drugs. We're completely wrong about this, and Martin Luther King nailed it in 1963 when he developed this idea here. And of course, the materialism, how else can you justify these major drug distributors like Cardinal Health and McKesson? How else can you justify what they're doing except severe, pathological, overwhelming greed? I'd hate to think that our generation is going to be known as the generation that made greed socially acceptable. But at the moment, we seem to be. That's what's happening with this opioid crisis. It's spiraled out of control because of the number of people who are so captivated by just pathological levels of greed. And I'm going to just go ahead to one more picture here and then come back to this here. And that is, these are two people that are part of the Purdue Pharma. This was a company founded by 3 doctors. And these 3 doctors got together, and they were doing nickel and dime stuff. It was a company going nowhere. And then they latched on to OxyContin and started marketing it. And they reassured everyone that this was not dangerous. This was not harmful. And then, of course, their sales went through the roof, and they're making $3 billion a year. This company is entirely held by a family of 20 people. It's not on the New York Stock Exchange, held by 20 people. And the lawsuits have started to roll in. They settled their first one in 2007. They settled for $600 million. But as long as none of the family went to jail, that's just the cost of doing business. That's not going to affect their philosophy. They have now been named in 1,600 lawsuits for what they're doing. And that includes the lawsuits that we just heard about from Macomb County. They're suing 3 entities, and I think Purdue Pharma is one of those. And this family's not dumb. They've been shunting hundreds of millions of dollars to offshore accounts in anticipation of the fact they're going to lose all these lawsuits. So they're talking about filing for Chapter 11 for Purdue Pharma. But they've introduced a new campaign. They're going to start treating addiction. So they're going to start trying to make hundreds of millions of dollars treating the problem that they've created. And they thought a perpetual motion machine was not possible. They're going to do it.
I'm sorry, but that is a pretty harsh statement. They didn't create this problem.
I'm not going to say it's a harsh statement. I'm going to say it's worse than that, Larry. These guys are abysmal. Okay, there we go. All right.
That company didn't create this problem.
It's like cigarettes.
No, but they, the thing is, though, that this is a complex problem, and I talked about all of the factors that come into play.
Every time somebody tells me something's a complex problem, I get the idea they think I'm not able to understand.
No, but I'm saying within the realm of the opioid crisis, this is a particularly flagrant aspect of that. They didn't create the problem. Nope, you're right. They didn't. Yep.
Well, they said that they told all the doctors that it was not habit forming. They told all the doctors that it was not habit forming.
Yeah.
So don't tell me they didn't start something.
Yep, right behind you, Mel. Yes.
One of the things I saw was that when people started crushing it and snorting it,
Yeah.
they reformulated it. But what that did is extend their patent.
Yes. Oh.
And they just extended their patent for another.
I didn't know that. Yeah, that's right. Okay, so let's just take a few more minutes and then close here, all right? So question about what we can do about this. On a professional level, professional counselors are going to work with people who are addicted to have behavioral interventions to help these people restore some balance in their life because they've gone through this addiction phase in which they've lost interest in normal, healthy things. So they want to help them restore balance, help them enhance the salience of natural, healthy events by social contact, by exercise. They want to try to work with them on stress reduction, help them cope with negative emotions, which are all part of the addictive process, improve executive function, self-regulation, and then help the recovering patients change their circle of friends and the circumstances that they've been in that tend to make this addiction repetitive, to help them relapse. Since, you know what, I can give you references from the New England Journal of Medicine.
Programs. I know what the results are. The recidivism rate in a year down the line is well over 50%.
Oh, much higher than that, I bet, Larry. And that's,
Don't present that to these people as if this is some cure for this problem. It's
well,
not.
I'm not done. I'm not done.
Let's let Felix finish.
All right. So another component of this in terms of public health policy is to recognize this component of the neuroplasticity and the immature nervous system of younger people. When the drinking age was raised from 18 to 21, there was a dramatic reduction in traffic fatalities. And we ought to consider raising the age of cigarette smoking to 21 because we know these neural circuits don't mature until ages 21 to 25. So I think that's a public health implication that we can draw from this model. The other thing is that I think the United States may be the only country in which when a patient comes to a doctor's office, they can get free samples of opioids. Whereas throughout the European Union, they're forbidden to give out free samples of opioids. And we do it in this country through the 30-day voucher, the 10-day voucher, the 20-pill voucher, these pill vouchers. We don't just, it's not like Halloween where, you know, you give them out, everybody comes to the door. But it's still actually starting them on the medicine. And since 10% of those people are going to become addicted, it's a pathway toward worsening the problem. In those areas in which people are able to get health care insurance, they do a much better job of getting on treatment to protect them against addiction. And that includes, let's say, the use of naloxone or buprenorphine, which is the new generation of methadone. And in Massachusetts, for example, where they've made a major effort to insure their population, only 2.5% of the population is not insured, and 60% of those people are on comprehensive therapy for their addiction, including pharmacologic support. So it's not just the behavioral modifications that I mentioned earlier, but it's the pharmacologic support. Whereas in Texas, where they declined participation in the Affordable Care Act, and 12% of the population is uninsured, only 30% of the drug addicts have access and get treatment for their addiction. In France, when they made it easy to use buprenorphine, the methadone-like compound for the treatment of addiction, their overdose deaths dropped by 80%. So there is substantial evidence that a pharmacologic approach to the management of addiction has major benefits. And countries have shown that by public policy change, they can make that happen. Now, here's some myths about this buprenorphine. One myth is that it's complicated to use. Well, my daughter practices addiction medicine in Baltimore. It's annoying to deal with the drug companies and their pre-authorization, but otherwise it's not difficult to use. One other myth is that it substitutes a narcotic-like medication for an addiction, so really it's just providing one addiction to replace another addiction. But no, that's not true. Buprenorphine does not have addictive qualities. It doesn't have that, the patient who's taking that doesn't have their life transformed by this medicine, that's all they can think about is getting their next dose. It doesn't destroy executive function. It doesn't cause negative emotions. It just blocks the effect of the dysphoria that's associated with the addiction process. And detoxification is effective. No, there is no research evidence at all that detox programs are effective for addiction. They may be effective for alcohol, but they're not effective for addiction. And when we think about this too, we've got things that we need to do as a society to realign healthcare prescription plans so that if a doctor wants to prescribe a medicine for diabetes, they have to get pre-authorization for certain medications. Okay, if they have to get pre-authorization to manage the addiction medicines, it shouldn't be any more difficult than getting pre-authorization for diabetes. The other problem is incarceration. When people go to jail, they can't get buprenorphine. So here we've got somebody who's got a disease process that's medically understandable, and we know what's going on, and we know that detox is not effective, yet in our jails it's not allowed to take the pharmacologic method, either methadone or buprenorphine, to relieve that addiction. So when a person is released from jail, their likelihood of dying of an overdose is 10 times that of the general population, because these changes that occur in the neural circuits are permanent. That person is going to be craving a narcotic the rest of their life. These are permanent changes. And when they get out of jail, their likelihood of overdose is extremely high. So that's this slide here. So I've already done our worst criminals ever. And now I'd saved the last 3 slides in which I didn't write the answers in. I said, where do we go next? That is, the people in the room here. We're not involved in writing national policy or healthcare policy or anything like that. What do we do next? And you may recognize these first 3 things. They're part of the Eightfold Path of Buddhism, which starts with right thinking, right speech, and right action. I was hoping to get some, and I still am hoping to have you offer some suggestions about this. But for me, for example, in terms of right thinking, if I've had any impact today, and if there's been any one lesson today, it's that centuries of treating addiction as a criminal act and punishing it by incarceration haven't worked. This is a medical problem. This is a brain disease problem. And just thinking about it differently is a good start. And so that's my first hope, that you think about this problem differently than you might have before. Anyone else have some other ideas about right thinking?
They give those drugs to the people in jail. Because I've seen people come out of jail and they take the fentanyl and they're gone.
Well, a lot of politicians are elected on a campaign of get tough on crime. And they're elected on a campaign of having zero tolerance for drug use. And they don't understand that buprenorphine is not an opioid. And so they put up with these policies that are completely irrational.
How expensive is it, though?
The buprenorphine?
Yeah.
I don't know. It's expensive enough you need pre-authorization. It's not a $4 generic. And so you're right, but it probably contributes to the cost of a prisoner. You know, and you know we have like roughly 10 million people in jail per year in America.
10 years ago, it cost $33,000 a year
Mm-hmm.
to incarcerate.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. It's probably twice that now. Well, it may not be twice that because we've shipped it out to the lowest bidder with for-profit companies, but it's still very, very expensive. And that's why we need to ask the question, is this the best use of our money? Should we be sending people to jail because they sold, 3 OxyContin pills to somebody else? Is that a good use of our money, to send them to jail for 6 to 12 months? The typical person charged with a crime like that pleads guilty rather than try to fight it in court. Yes?
Okay, I have a question. I'm trying to connect all of these dots between
Yep.
the neurotransmittal and
Yep.
what happens in
Yep.
an addiction.
Yep.
And if there are permanent changes
Yep.
in the,
the
your
brain.
mind, in the
Yep.
brain, then, and they cannot be changed, then they're facing a lifetime of dealing with these, of behavior modifications in order to
And
live a normal
pharmacologic
life.
support. Yeah.
Okay, so, and I'm thinking, you've said that people are incarcerated because of addictions, but it's not usually because of the addiction. So, they are incarcerated because they steal something or
Right.
whatever to get the
Exactly.
drug.
Yep.
So then do
That's
we
true.
have separate prison systems and procedural
Right.
processes for incarceration
Yeah.
based on what they do? Because
Right.
you are incarcerated, you're put on a track
Right.
for whatever you are, and the prosecutor who decides, yes, I'm going to get tough on crime.
No,
But
you're exactly right. When a
there
when a
has to be
violent act
something.
happens, let's say in the city of Detroit, 80% of the time, the victim is either drunk or high on drugs. 80% of the time, the perpetrator is either drunk or high on drugs. That's why when we think about the public health aspects of violence, we tend to misinterpret my risk of, for example, me going down to Highland Park and working every Monday in Highland Park at Focus Hope. My risk is actually quite low. I'm sober every day when I show up. So I'm doing my part to stay out of violence. Yeah. But so getting back to your point though, so that means we're taking somebody who's, let's say, 18, they commit some violent act and they're high on opioids and they go to prison. And this medical model says that they should be entitled to treatment for their opioid addiction just the same way a diabetic would still be allowed to get their diabetic management while they're in prison. And it's likely to be a lifetime treatment, just like the diabetic.
That's a whole different prison model.
It is, that's right.
I think we consider ourselves a faith-based community.
Yes.
I was very disturbed about 6 weeks ago when a friend of mine who acknowledged that she's now addictive but is irreligious said, "You are religious. If I believed in a higher power, would it help me overcome my addiction? What should we as faith-based people be doing as our right thinking?"
Right. I think we have to recognize that there is that benefit, that part of the problem with addiction is losing executive function, it's losing skills in judgment, it's losing interest in things in life that provide joy and happiness. And for a faith-based person, their religion provides a lot of those things. The problem is these chemicals are so powerful that for the majority of people who are addicted, that's not going to be enough. They're going to need, besides behavioral therapy, besides a warm, supportive environment, they're going to need to have these chemicals, buprenorphine, for example.
Now, if churches were doing a better job, would fewer people start the addiction process?
I would hope so, but that's, if parents were doing a better job, if school systems were doing a better job, if we had more healthy television, I don't know. This is why I put this up here. These are the questions as we move into this next phase. And Barry, you could reach the decision, I'm not a policy wonk, but I am somebody who enjoys a rich circle of friends. And so I can discuss this with my friends and see if I can raise the level of conversation to provide a more healthy context to looking at addiction. Because that's part of what we need.
But if we spent the money that we're presently spending on prisons, or anti-addiction medicine,
Yeah.
on better schooling for kids, particularly in Pontiac, would that be a better use of our money than trying to fight addiction, rather get the kids going right in the first place?
Preventative instead of...
It's such a complicated thing. One of the other problems I'm working on down at Focus Hope is lead poisoning. The prevalence of lead poisoning in the Focus Hope neighborhood is 3.5 times higher than it was in Flint at the height of the Flint water crisis. And yet it's only 10% as high, 20% as high as it was 20 and 30 years ago. And many people are saying that the reason crime statistics have dropped is because we've done a better job on removing lead. Solid evidence that we have less crime because of reduction of serum lead levels in this generation. So, the question you've asked is so important, but I think the the way I would look at that question is say, you know what, isn't this where we should be directing our policy? We have a lot of governmental policy going on now that's got a lot of us distracted by demagoguery and hate speech. Personally, I think we'd be much better off if we said, what do we really care about as a society? You know, in my field, medicine, physician burnout is at an all-time high. Yet my boss is going to get a bonus if my productivity increases. I think he should get a bonus if I fill out my questionnaire and say I'm more happy this year than I was last year. And many countries are moving to the idea of, instead of measuring a gross domestic product, measure the happiness of your population. Start answering those questions that you're asking. And stop our preoccupation with materialism, with all of these things related to financial gain. Yes. Oh, here.
Okay,
Yes,
so
Sandra.
you,
Okay, I'm sorry, I'm talking way too much. All right.
so years ago, when there was alcoholism in a family and friends could do an intervention that could be effective for the person stopping alcoholism. Does that model work for opiates?
I think it's more limited than it is for alcohol, but sure it can work. If somebody is in a family situation and they've got a problem with drug abuse, and they say, I'm going to go out and meet with my friends, and their friends are the ones who were part of the addiction pattern, and they can prevent them from joining those friends and getting into that same environment that was associated with drug use, that's part of the solution to the problem. Yeah.
We're going to stop at this point. I have not been able to benefit from your presentation except for the last few questions, and I want to thank you.
Thank you, Will.
Because everything that you're, at least from what I can gauge from those last few questions, you're picking up on a lot of really important tensions. And I understand that this has been a meeting in which a lot of people have had some strong opinions, which is fine, which is important. And this is not an easy topic to discuss. You know, because I come from a family where we have struggled with addiction to just about everything.